Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. When we are walking through the understanding of the DFARS 252, 204, 7021 update. And a couple things. One is that we're going to go an hour and a half. My apologies for the discrepancy in the announcement. There's a lot to cover, and there's a little bit of time. We're after the hour and a half. We will cover down on questions. If we stop a little bit early, we'll start covering down on questions or questions or rollover. I hope everybody's doing great today, and you should buckle down because we've got a lot to cover in the context of the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 update with the 32 CFR Part 170 CMC rule. We appreciate our sponsors, and we are grateful for the opportunity to partner with Cross Timbers PTAC and Texas MEP, along with several other MEPs, in bringing the Mythbusters series, continuing to do that over the past 4 years, I believe. 5 years, I guess. Well, we're going on 5 years. And it is a 6-part series on training education, and we dive into the details. As you will see, there are no glittering generalities. There are no platitudes that we will talk about today. We will talk about the details, or we won't talk about anything at all. So that's exactly the way the Mythbusters is functioned in order for people to understand the requirements and the complexity of understanding these requirements and implementing them over a 6-part series. So look for that on LinkedIn, and please feel free to sign up. We also are with sort of great remorse and expectation. We decided at the last minute to shift the CMC Implementers Conference, the Southwest Regional Conference, hosted by Southern Methodist University, to February. Why do we do that? Especially at the last minute. That it was a very hard decision. The reason why is because there is a lot for you to learn when the CMC rule comes out. And that final rule is expected to be published literally any day now over the next few weeks. And we will also have the understanding of that rule, the understanding of and the publishing of the CMMC assessment process, CAP document. All of these culminating documents come together, and we'll go over them in detail in this. And in order for you to carefully and accurately navigate the certifying process, it will not be the same as the joint surveillance, right? There are different authorities, there are different procedures, there are many different details from what we've done over this past couple of years. So it will be important to digest that information and let the dust settle in order to prepare you beginning in February for really getting your arms around that. So a little bit about DTC Global for those of you who do not know us. We are very fortunate to have very deep ties into the CMC ecosystem. And I was very fortunate enough to be serving on the Cyber AB board and the foundation of the board during a very difficult 2020, and establishing the board and standing it up, along with many other amazing people who really sacrificed an untold amount in order to do so over the first few years. And I'm grateful to their sacrifice, and certainly grateful for the contribution, or we would not be here. In addition, we have deep the establishing of the CMC Industry Standards Council after I left the Cyber AB board. And we have a deep interest and a deep a feel for the CMMC requirements in the context of the DFARS 7012. So there are very few people on the planet who have spent as much time understanding these requirements, and that's to my wife's chagrin. And so we are grateful to give back, to provide insight and knowledge in understanding these requirements, along with the other amazing people at DTC Global. We do this for a living, folks. This is what we do. We are highly specialized in understanding these requirements and helping people implement them right the first time. All right. With that, we are also grateful to be a part of a much larger organization, the CMC Industry Standards Council, for which I'm chairman and one of the founders. And get to it. Okay, so the content that we're going to provide you, we will not provide the slides, but you are authorized to do screenshots, and I highly recommend that. I try in this instance, most of the time the slides are very complex, but because we've got a good great disparity amongst the audience, from those who are very familiar with these requirements and subject matter experts, all the way to those who are sort of dusting things off and realizing that they've got to meet these requirements and wanting to learn more, and everyone in between. So feel free, please, to take screenshots, okay? And I will emphasize the things I'm trying to tell you along the way. And of course, don't hesitate to ask whatever questions that you may have and put them in the chat as it comes. All right, so let's start not at the beginning. Let's start in 2023 and 2024 when after the Great Reset, okay? There was a rollout of national strategy, and you need to understand that the CMC rule culminates that strategy, and it is indeed far-reaching. It is truly transformative amongst the federal contracting and subcontracting ecosystem. The President's National Cybersecurity Strategy came out in March of 2023, and just 3 very, very short months later, the National Cybersecurity Strategy came out with their implementation plan. Now, I've been doing this basically my entire adult life, and I've never seen an implementation plan for a national document come out of the White House in just 3 or 4 months later. It's very important that you realize that they mean business, and I'm going to show you that what we're learning today is in direct one-to-one alignment with what's happening to us at the national level and at the agency level. So, holding the stewards of our data, meaning the United States of America, in concert with its industry partners, that data accountable for either their protection of that data, their misuse of that data, or their lack of protection and safeguarding of that data. Okay, and out of that strategy came the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Strategy in 2024. Okay, and it is in alignment with these objectives. So we look at the 3.5. Leveraging federal procurement to improve accountability. And that's exactly what the CMC rule and the CMC contract clause are doing. And I'll show you the details of that, of course. Lastly, securing the global supply chain, okay? All the way top to bottom, you will see the rapid expansion of supply chain included in these requirements. That is coming. It will expand, and the details of that will be more and more difficult to manage as we move forward if you don't get it right now. So you really have to pay attention to the details and understanding what happens if you're a multiple contract award winner. What about your supply chain? What are your responsibilities with that? What's the prime contractor's responsibility? What about the subcontractor's responsibility to its subcontractors? So in that scope, you really need to pay attention to the details. All right. Sorry, I'm not sure whether these animations are jacked up. So let's understand the context of the 32 CFR Part 2002 requirement in the context of the scheme of the requirements, starting at the CUI laws, regulations, and government-wide policies. Okay, all the traceability of what we're doing has a home someplace in a document or a standard above it. And it's very important that you realize that these documents and these standards are nested within each other. There is nothing that you are having to do which is its own private Idaho. The CMC standard does not stand alone. It never has. Each of the documents, each of the requirements are nested within federal requirements and are nested within DoD requirements, okay, and DoD policy, okay? And when we look at the 32 CFR, it focuses on national security. That's the reason why the CMC rule is a 32 CFR rule. When we bring that down to Chapter 2, which is the DoD section of that, at the 48 CFR, we look at the fact that the 48 CFR 252, 204, 70, 12 contract clause, which is the original contract clause, initiated the requirements for all DoD industry, okay? And that's been the requirement, the standing requirement, since December 31st of 2017. We have truly brought this on ourselves because we have failed to meet these requirements since 2017. And uncharacteristically, the DoD has been very, very, very gracious in implementing and enforcing these requirements, although there are many, potentially thousands of False Claims Act in the hopper right now. All right. So that time and that grace has come to an end, folks. And you're going to see how these things are nested together to ensure that there is accountability from the prime contractor all the way down to all tiers within the supply chain. So in 2019 and 2020, we had the birth of the CMMC, and then we had the requirements which had to catch up to the expectation that there was going to be a certification requirement for the entire defense industrial base, and it got ahead of itself. And it was the right thing to do to take the pause, however painful, to take the time to ensure that the appropriate laws, regulations, and government-wide policies caught up to align with the expectations along with the third-party certification required by CMMC. The DFARS case was born in 2019, but it was put on hold, as you well know, and then now it has emerged with an update into the DFARS 252, 204, 7021 clause. Now, the 7019 clause and 7020 clause are very important because those establish eligibility right now underneath the DFARS 7012. But I'm going to show you how those are nested together in the ability to complete the third-party certification requirements underneath the new contract clause. So right now, under 19 and 20, you are not eligible to execute a contract unless you've done these things. You have to conduct a self-assessment. You have to score that self-assessment underneath the DoD self-assessment methodology V1.2.1. Okay, if you are not aware of that, that must be done every 3 years, but that score must be accurate. And how's it accurate? Well, we have to register that score with the DoD. We have to have evidence to support that score. You are not allowed to arbitrarily go through a security control and assessment and then say, well, I think we've got that, and then give yourself credit for that. You must have evidence to support the fact that your score is a valid score. And those POAM items, which are not complete, must be completed in the active usage of that POAM until they're all done. Okay. So now we have in order to do each of these things, that creates eligibility for our current contracts. So these things are resting requirements, standing requirements right now, and you're going to see how they're nested into the contract clause themselves with the update. So the current requirements in contract eligibility hinge on evidence, and that evidence begins with a risk assessment, and that risk assessment is required to be done annually. Okay, that risk assessment is already a part of the NIST standing requirements and the NIST 800-171 Rev 2. A security control assessment must also be conducted annually. Why? Because those are two prerequisite documents that are necessary in order to update the system security plan. The system security plan underneath DoD policy must be updated annually or with any major changes to the security of that system. You're also going to see how that's nested into the reporting requirements underneath the 7021 contract clause. Okay. The things that I have not yet done go on my plan of action and milestones. Why? And that in itself is a document. It's not we think we have one. It's not, we used to have one, but it's not up to date. We must have that document, and it's required because it is required by evidence underneath the DoD right now. Okay. In their DIPCAC highs, and that standard has been set for the CMMC third-party assessments. Now, when we execute our self-assessment underneath the current requirements, that's underneath the DoD self-assessment methodology of the V1.2.1. And again, the SBRS score must be set every 3 years. However, that score must be accurate, and very likely that that your first score was not accurate because of the immaturity and the understanding of the requirements. and the complexity and the expectation of the level of evidence that's required to support your score. So I urge you to reconsider what your current SPRS score, because that will come back to haunt you severely in the days to come. Okay, you work the poem until it's complete. All of these requirements, okay, to satisfy the 32 CFR Part 2002, all the CUI notices, apply the CUI registry requirements for the appropriate categories of CUI within your environment, applying DoD policy in order to meet the DFARS 7012, and then conducting the additional requirements underneath the 7019 and 7020 are all necessary right now. Okay. In order to emphasize that, I will show you just a snippet of the 7019 and 7020 clause, because unless you've met these requirements, you cannot be considered for an award, nor are you allowed to award a subcontract in performance of a contract award underneath the DoD. So it's quite possible that if you've not done these things, that you are not eligible for your current contracts right now, and you are not, and potentially your subcontractors are not eligible to receive their contracts right now. If you do not address this, this is going to avalanche on top of you underneath the CMC 7021 rule, and I will show you why that's true. Okay, so the totality of the requirements for DFARS 7012 are listed on the right-hand side. We must do all these things in preparation for the CMC model. Okay, and let's get to what the contract clause looks like. So I want you to take a quick moment though and look on the left-hand side and look at all of the references that are absolutely necessary for you to meet these requirements and understand the requirements. Okay, all of the references point to very specific things that you must understand and you must do in order to meet these requirements. Okay, do not place your faith, right, in a 25-cent arcade psychic machine, hoping that you're going to get the right answers for CMMC. This is not the way to go. You must understand the complex, even though these documents are complex, even though they are difficult to navigate through, they are your primary references for understanding each of the requirements that you're expected to do and how you are supposed to implement them underneath the current DFARS 7012 contract clause. Worse yet, though, do not pay attention to the yelling and screaming matches on LinkedIn. That is a high-risk venture. People who purport, who have credentials, who believe that they are accurate and they understand the requirements are dead wrong. Or worse yet, they're partially right or partially wrong, and it would be very difficult for you to discern what you should do. You are making very important decisions on the future of your company and the proportion of income that your company receives from their DoD contracts based on the yelling and screaming matches on LinkedIn. That is about as dangerous as it gets. So please stay away from LinkedIn, and that's all I'm going to say about that. All right, so let's get down to it. So the CMC model is built on the fact, on a very simple premise. It is intended to verify and validate your implementation of the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause. The purpose of the model is to verify what you have already supposed to have done. That's what you need to know, that there is nothing new under the sun in relationship to the requirements, but there are additional requirements that the CMC model in the 32 CFR rule and the DFARS contract clause require of you. So it is built on top of those things, not in substitution of. Okay, the CMMC assessment guide is a reference that can be used at your discretion. It is not a mandatory reference. Why? Because what I've been saying for the past 5 years is accurate with the standard, and there's only one standard for the implementation in this standard of 171 and 171 alpha, and that's those standards themselves. Okay. Now there is supplemental guidance and additional details that are good to know from the CMC documents, But in reference to the implementation, 171 and 171 alpha are the standard for their implementation. As I mentioned, though, there are additional requirements and there are additional references that you will absolutely need to use in order to be successful. So certification in the model is built on the verification and validation of 7012. You need to know that. So when people tell you that we're not paying attention to 7012 anymore, or you don't need to do that anymore, they're absolutely wrong. Okay, unless of course, their first interpretation was wrong in itself. So there we go. All right. So what do we have to know in addition to this? We have to know that the CMC model and the 32 CFR Part 170 draft rule now, which will be a final rule, includes, including the 7021 contract clause, includes the 7019, includes the 7012 in order to verify and validate the implementation of the DFARS 7012. So it includes the 7019, the 7020. You have to do both of those things. And you have to do it and follow the procedures that are provided and the requirements that are provided underneath the 7021 clause, contract clause. And you have to use as a primary reference for understanding those procedures in that process, the 32 CFR Part 170 rule. Now it's 360 pages, and obviously it's very complex, okay? The DoD self-assessment methodology or DoD assessment methodology V.1.2.1 will be replaced by the CMC assessment methodology, which has not yet been released. The CMC scoping guide, which is the current draft underneath the V.2.11, is an excellent document that has been updated. With many of the recommendations provided by the CMC Industry Standards Council and many, many others. Okay. And that scoping guide is a good, solid document, but you must pay attention to the details because the things that they have changed in reference to the older versions you may have read, the devil is in the details, folks. Okay. Especially when we talk about assets and so on and so forth. Now, the CMC scoping guide will guide you, but there are additional things that you need to understand in the context of scoping, and we're just going to touch on a few when we're reviewing the CMC 7021 rule. The CMC assessment procedure is being revised right now and will be released. That's how the third-party organization, the C3PO, is going to assess you and conduct their assessment. But that's not impactful to the actual standards for which they're expected of you. Okay, those standards have been set previously during the DoD DIPCAC high assessments in the Joint Surveillance Program, and they've been and the C3POs have learned from the DIPCAC, and what we're searching now is consistency of the enforcement and the understanding of those standards. All right. Now, you are not able to even proceed. Let me go back real quick and emphasize something. If I've done these things, and I have POAM items, and the POAM items include any of these in red, you are not even allowed to proceed to affirmation or proceed to certification. Let me state that again. You will not be eligible in phase one to affirm the fact that you've met these requirements if you have these POAM items, A through E, on your POAM. You will not be able to proceed to certification if you have A through E on your POAM. Now, satisfying A through E is no easy task because your external connections are one of the major pieces of the complexity of the puzzle in implementing these requirements. Think about your ERP system. Think about your cloud services, where you process, store, transmit CUI. And we're going to touch on this a bit, but I want you to keep in mind that that is one major risk factor that you must address in order to proceed once this kicks off on its effective date, which is expected very soon in probably around March of 2025. Once you start the affirmation process, any POAM item that you list, once you've affirmed the fact that you've met these requirements, must be closed out in 180 days. So let's say that you've knocked out A through E. There are no standing requirements and you've done it correctly. If you have any additional POAM items, once you begin the affirmation process, you have the clock starts on your closeout of every single item in order to meet requirements. Okay, that's very important. If you don't meet that 180-day cutoff, your conditional affirmation is withdrawn. And you have to report that, by the way, and I'll emphasize that as we go through this. So listen, folks, this is the devil's in the details, and you better pay attention here, or it's going to come back to haunt you. All right. So the CMC rule, the totality of the rule. Yes, I've got my my risk assessment, my security assessment, and system security plan, my POAM items. I've got my evidence of all of the appropriate score. It's an accurate score, and I've registered in SPRS. And then now I have to address any of POAM items. The restricted POAM items are obviously the most important. And then now I have my residual POAM items. Okay. All of those things must be done in sequence underneath the 32 CFR rule, Part 170 rule, and underneath the contract clause. And we'll walk through how the contract clause knocks that out. Okay. So the DoD is obviously executing the implementation of their phase rollout as the 7021 clause states. Okay. It's going to be done over a 3-year period as the 7021 clause states. Okay. And the 32 CFR Part 170 rule is an absolute essential document for you to understand. It is not a good to have or good to think about, or maybe I read it or skimmed it over a couple times. You must understand that document, because the nuts and bolts of the actual CMMC process and the CMC requirements and the CMC isms that are required in addition to the 7012 are all found in the Part 170 document. Okay. And when it becomes a final rule, you have to pay attention to the details, folks. All right. So what's interesting about the 7021 clause is that the time period is determined by the when it's going to be actually required within a contract is required by the program office or the requiring activity. Now, originally the program office, the CMC program office, had control over that, but the requiring activity now also has control over that. So it may not be as a controlled release as they would hope. Remember that the program office has a timeline, but at the end of the day, the requiring activity are the folks that are in charge of that. That is you should be keenly aware of what the risk that entails. Okay. Now, these requirements in the 7021 clause are expected of you at the time of the award. At the time of the award, if the contract clause is in the contract and it requires you to be certified, then at the time of award you must be certified. And also, if it requires a self-assessment, which will be a real small minority, probably less than 5%, then you must have completed that self-assessment. If the 7021 clause is present and the DoD allows for a period after award, it is allowed in the Part 170 rule. So if they said, well, you have 180 days to certify after the time of award, that is by exception. That's not the norm. So it should be clear to everyone that the DoD is expecting you to be certified as required at the time of award. And you may be allowed to have a grace period if you're standing in line for certification, but there's no room for error there. Okay. Now, the current, as I mentioned, that could be for the CMC certification or the self-assessment, and really the self-assessment is going to be required for a very few minority. That begins with the enforcement period. So the expectation is that phase 1 will begin in Q1 of 2025. So if contracts are required to be certified then they will be required to be certified. If they're required to have a self-assessment done and the affirmation complete, then that will be required for those contracts in phase 1. Okay. I want you to start paying attention to this language is over and over and over again inside the 7021 clause. For all information systems that process, store, or transmit CUI during the contract performance. Okay. So those systems that are necessary, what the NIST Standard 171 describes as the essential capabilities, right, to perform the work, right, that process, store, transmit CUI or FCI, of course, during the performance of the work, are required to meet these requirements. All of the systems, okay? And we're gonna pull on those threads as we go through. So what does process, store, transmit mean? Because that's really important, folks. And it's defined in the CMC rule itself, the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, as the means that the data can be used by an asset, edited, generated, manipulated, or printed. The data is inactive or at rest, meaning stored, inactive or rest on an asset. Okay. That includes physical format and digital formats. Okay. So storage means physical storage of documents. It means digital storage of documents. Okay. Transmit means that it's being transferred from one asset to another or one network to another. Okay. That transmit is very important because the opportunity, the ability to access CUI, to process, store, transmit that information creates creates security control inheritance. The actual processing, storing, and transmitting of that information also creates security control inheritance. And doing that for cloud services, for example, which we'll talk about, also creates a set of security control inheritances. So, and when we talk about assets, the CMC scoping guide describes it very similarly, okay? And what we want to know is that when we process, store, or transmit CUI in relative to an asset, that asset becomes in scope. When that asset is logically or physically connected to any of those assets are in scope until they are isolated or until they are separated physically or logically from the network that is going to be authorized to process, store, transmit CUI. So your entire world, digital world, and your facility is in scope, even if it's not permitted, or even if it's prohibited, or even if it's even if you want it to be, okay, until you begin logical and physical separation, until you begin the segmentation that's necessary in order to confine the CUI to where it is lawfully permitted, okay, and your entire scope of your company or your business units may not be lawfully permitted. You have to understand the requirements. So the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, the 32 CFR Part 170 rule and the 7021 rule redefine CUI, or an alternate definition. It's not redefined. Provide an alternate definition for 7021 for the purposes of the Part 170 clause. Okay, it simplifies it, but there are some catches. So CUI means the information that the government creates or possess, or an entity creates or possess on behalf of the government, that a law, regulation, or government policy requires or permits an agency to handle using safeguarding or dissemination controls. Now, this definition is taken from pre-existing definitions. So they're not if you are new to this definition, and you were only aware of the description in the 7012 contract clause, you may not be aware that all of these elements are already required of you. Okay, so if you are an entity that creates or possesses CUI on behalf of the government, then you're required to meet the requirements that are described in the CR registry, and you're required to meet the DoD policy requirements underneath the 32 CFR Part 2002-16. You have to understand what those requirements are for the categories of CUI that you have in performance of the work. And you have to understand also that the DoD is telling you that the safeguarding and dissemination controls matter. And we'll talk about that right now. Okay, so we have a DFARS 7012 contract clause. Okay, it's covered defense information under what you know underneath the DFARS 7012 contract clause. When it's CUI that's marked or otherwise identified or created and possessed on behalf of the DoD in performance of the work. Okay, so they're simplifying that definition so that you don't get confused for the folks out there who falsely believe that they don't have CUI unless it's marked. That's absolutely not true. The DoD is telling you that's not true in that definition right there. Okay, so if you are falsely underneath the belief that you do not have CUI unless it's marked, you are not reading the Part 2 of the definition of covered defense information, which is exactly what the DoD has simplified in the DFARS 252, 204, 7021 contract clause. Now, what does that mean? I've got covered defense information. Well, that's controlled technical information because that's the primary concern of the DoD. It could be any category of CUI relative to the performance of the work. Okay, where do we find out what controlled technical information is? Well, guess what? The DoD has created a DoD instruction for you to understand everything that you need to know about what controlled technical information is when you receive it or when you create it in performance of the contract or subcontract. That document is your Bible, so to speak, for controlled technical information because it describes what it means to have technical information. And there are 5 controlling definitions relative to what it means to have technical information. Okay. And it also describes the critical technologies and the export controlled information that is encompassed within the definition of controlled technical information. So if you have export controlled information, or if you have technical information and performance of a DoD contract, it's very likely that it fits within the controlled technical information definitions and controlling definitions that are referenced in the DoD instruction 5230.24. If everything that I said to you is new to you, you are behind the curve and you do not understand the depth and breadth of your controlled unclassified information and where it flows within your organization. Because until you understand those definitions, you will not really get your arms around the depth and breadth that the DoD is expecting of you to protect the technical information that you receive and that you develop in performance of their contracts or subcontracts. It's very important that you understand that this document exists and you understand that and you follow this document in order to scope and control the scope of your environment for the purposes of CMMC certification. Now, there's another component to this in that in the CMC 7021 clause, it says that we're going to include this in solicitation contracts using the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 12 procedures for the acquisition of commercial products and commercial services, excluding the acquisitions exclusively for what? Commercially off-the-shelf items, COTS items. Now, that's not for you to decide. There's a criteria for that, and it starts in the FAR Part 12, and we're going to talk about it briefly. So at the time of the award, you are required to have CMMC certification or CMMC self-assessment when the award is included, even for the acquisition of commercial items and commercial services, except, as I mentioned, that those commercial items and commercial services qualify as COTS items. Now, let's take that closer look. So on the left-hand side, we've walked through what it means for it to be controlled technical information underneath the DFARS 712. Everything on the left-hand side is standing and has been in existence since the beginning of the rule. Everything on the right-hand side has also been standing in existence since the beginning of the rule. Now it's just encompassed specifically within the contract clause in order to make it clear to everyone instead of 3 or 4 different places within DoD policy. If I have covered defense information as mentioned in the DFARS 7012, that qualifies as CUI, okay? When I receive it or develop it in performance of my contract, indifferent of whether it's marked or not, doesn't matter, folks. And that covered defense information, i.e. technical information, is in a military space purpose, okay? Or it's ITAR EAR information that's controlled, or I've taken information that's unique or been modified for the DoD purposes. All of that information constitutes CUI. If I have commercial off-the-shelf items or commercial items that meet the definition underneath the FAR Part 12, and I have not modified them, then they may be exempted underneath the requirements. But when I do modify them, a substantive modification, not the color, right? If I have something that's orange and I paint it green for the Army, that is a superficial change. However, if I add a thermal treatment to it or some unique specification unique to the DoD requirement, that may qualify as a substantive change. These things, all of these things matter when we're looking about what are the exceptions out of the requirements. And for some of you, that really matters. Okay. If the item is accepted, okay, meaning that it's exempted out of the requirements, then you don't have to meet the DFARS 7012. Okay. But if it doesn't meet the exemption requirements, then you do. So the FAR Part 12 and the definition underneath the Part 2.101, these have recently been updated, so you need to make sure that your references are the most the most recent. Those are very important in understanding the exemptions. Why? Because the DoD says that it intends to make the determination to apply the statute to the acquisition of commercial products, excluding commercial off-the-shelf items, and to the acquisition of commercial services. Okay. Therefore, if it's a commercial product and it qualifies as a COTS item, it would be excluded underneath the exemption. So there are only 3 exemptions. If you have a DoD contract that has the DFARS 7012, there are only 3 exemptions that are applicable to you to not have to meet these requirements. Number 1, that the information is lawfully publicly available. Okay. That the information is within the basic research paradigm of a generic scientific data, or that it's procured exclusively for the purposes of commercial off-the-shelf items. Then you meet the exemption criteria. Without that, it falls into the CUI category for technical information. Okay. This is a complicated process, and I highly recommend that you have someone who's highly qualified to help guide you if you think that you're on the edge. So the proposed rule adds this requirement to the 32 CFR Part 170 rule. It also adds procedures to do this. Okay. It requires the program office, meaning the issuer of the contract for CMMC or the requiring activity, the issuer of the contract, to verify whether or not you've done these things. So if they cannot verify that you've done these things, then you will not be eligible for the contract. Whereas before, verification wasn't necessarily required, right? They just asked you, are you required? Or are you eligible? Do you have an SPRS score? Well, what is it? And then they assume that you're telling the truth. Well, that's no longer the case. Okay. What's also important is that when you're getting ready to meet these requirements, that the DoD, when you have an information system that processes, stores, or transmits CUI, you've gone through the steps in order to meet these requirements. You have an SPRS score for that system or systems that are involved in the processing, storing, and transmitting CUI. Then the DoD is going to assign a unique ID to that contractor information system that processes, stores, or transmits CUI. If you have multiple business units that do different things, you're going to have multiple DoD UIDs that are assigned to each of those individual each individual IT systems. That's very important, and I will show you why. So you ask, well, what is a DoD UID? So a DoD UID is a DoD unique, defined on the left-hand side, is a unique identifier that means that it's going to have an alphanumeric string of 10 characters. Well, you're like, wow, 10 characters. That's a lot of characters. I'm going to show you why they have an alphanumeric string of 10 characters in just a minute. That's assigned when the supplier, when you've registered in the supplier performance risk system for each contractor assessment completed. So if you have one contractor assessment completed for 3 IT systems that are going to be in scope and you intend to certify, then it's going to assign one DoD UID to that system. But you better be careful about thinking about that strategy, okay? Because it's got its downfalls. All right. Here's why. Why would the DoD assign a 10-character ID to each of the systems that are required for assessment, that process, store, transmit, CUI? You want to know why? They're going to treat every single one of those in relationship to what? CMC certification. And here's how they're going to do it. So the current requirements are that underneath the DFARS 7012, we're expected to do a risk assessment, right? Everyone should be familiar with that. The security control assessment, everyone should be very familiar with that. that informs our system security plan. Everyone should absolutely be familiar with that. That system security plan has to be updated and has to be accurate. Okay. We have a plan of action milestones. We execute our DoD assessment methodology v2.1. We have to have all of the evidence which substantiates an accurate SPRS score, and we register an SPRS. And we've done that for a system or systems that are involved in the contract performance. And then we also have our external connections that are involved in that are within the scope of the requirements underneath the DFARS 7012 and DoD policy right now. That includes our cloud services. Yes, that includes our external service providers right now. And that also includes our subcontractors within the scope of DoD policy and the requirements, standing requirements right now. What we have, though, we have very specific guidance that must be followed in relationship to the CMC rule. And that's part of the hand in glove relationship between the 32 CFR Part 170 draft rule right now and the DFARS 7021 contract clause for the CMC rule. Now, when we have CUI that is processed, stored, or transmitted, these things come into scope and they have to be done. So if these systems provide protection for CUI, they come into scope. This all should sound familiar. If they're permitted access to CUI through an external connection, or a person is permitted access to CUI, they come into scope. Access through a logical connection or physical connection. If I have physical access to CUI, I'm in scope, even if I'm not permitted, even if I'm prohibited, right? And that's the reason why we have restrictions. That's the reason why we have separation. And that's the reason why we have to enforce the requirements and monitor the enforcement of the requirements. Okay, so all of these things come into scope underneath the current rules right now, but we get very specific guidance when we switch over to the CMMC. So scoping really begins here. Underneath the CMC 32 CFR Part 170 rule, the CMMC assessment methodology has been replaced for the DoD assessment methodology v1.2.1. Okay, it'll be tailored to meet these requirements. Okay, we're also given the guidance underneath the Part 170 rule and underneath the 7012 or 7021 contract clause that an assigned DoD UID will be necessary for all networks that are in scope and that are required to be assessed. So every single network that processes, stores, or transmits CUI is required to be assessed, and you are only allowed to use those networks that have been that have been assessed to process, store, transmit CUI. And you have to report when you don't follow that. Okay? So let's stick with the details. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So we have the Part 170 guidance, and we know that those contracts, those systems that are used in performance of the contract must be assigned a DoD UID. So the DoD is immediately keeping track of all of the network assets that are in scope that are in relationship to certification through the DoD UID. The external connections are also important to that scope and to that relationship. And cloud services have their own certification underneath FedRAMP Monitor equivalent. It's not clear whether or not that a DoD UID will be required of the cloud services. External service providers will also clearly be in scope. Why? Because some of them will process, store, transmit CUI. Others will help protect CUI in relationship to security protection data. All right. And then, of course, our vendors are in scope. Why? Because sometimes we share CUI directly with an external connection into our environment, or we send them CUI or shared CUI through electronic means or through the appropriate and compliant methods, such as GCC High and email. This relationship underneath the 7021 rule solidifies. So we have people who process, store, or transmit CUI underneath the contract performance. We have external connections that shared and developed CUI, and now this directly impacts the suppliers and the vendors and your responsibility underneath the 7021 rule. Okay, it's explicit. All right, so let's look at this a different way. Okay, so we have a contract, we have CUI, we have Acme Manufacturing, who has a contract, who has a bunch of different folks that are involved that may process, store, transmit CUI, or may not be allowed to process or transmit CUI. Okay, They all the folks that do process, store, transmit CUI or FCI inherent security practices. Those that don't. Okay, and that separation is a logical or a physical separation, or the control is the implementation of internal boundaries and external boundaries. Okay, all of those things come into scope underneath CMC explicitly underneath the guidance provided by the 32 CFR Part 170 rule in Appendix A of that in Section 11. Okay, so this anywhere the CUI flows is exactly what's going to be in scope, and if it's permitted, you pass. If it's not permitted or eligible or they're qualified, then you don't pass. So let's think about this a different way. So think about what the DoD is doing here. The idea is that you have traceability from the contracts to your SPR score to certification at all tiers. That includes subcontractors, that includes vendors, and external service providers. All right. So when we process, store, transmit CUI and in performance of a contract, it has to have a DoD UID. It has to be identified by the DoD that it is in scope and that it is encompassed within a certification. Whether it's yours or not may or may not be relevant, but it must be encompassed within a certification. Why? Because they're processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, and in your case, you're sharing CUI with them, and so they must be eligible, they must be qualified, and they must have a DoD UID, right? So this relationship provides traceability, and that 10-digit character or 8-digit character number, I think it is 10, I can't remember, becomes a VIN ID, if you will, like your car, to be able to have traceability all the way down the line from the highest tier all the way to the lowest tier per contractor. Okay. So that relationship is going to solidify, and there's going to be no mystery whether or not your brand new network or your old network or a new vendor has eligibility to participate in the environment. Why? Because they will have traceability all the way through, and you have the duty to report when you don't meet these requirements. Okay. All right. So if you have this idea that you're going to start out with a 2-person enclave and you're going to expand to include your 100-person contract, my friends, that is not going to work. You're going to get flagged right off the bat. So the provision requires language, okay, that the offers must notify when they are ineligible for an award. Now that's different right now. Right now, the vast majority of the defense industrial base is hiding, hoping that someone doesn't ask them. And if they don't ask them, then they don't have to worry about it. It's just the opposite, folks. You have the duty to notify when you are not eligible to receive a contract or award, okay? And that is going to cause some problems, folks. That is definitely going to cause some problems. So if you don't understand that there is a tightening noose around you, that there's going to be that the amazing grace that has been provided for you since 2017 has evaporated away, you're not paying attention. So if I have the duty to notify, the requirement to notify when I'm not eligible, that means that if I'm a 3rd tier or 17th tier sub and I'm not eligible to receive that contract for whatever reason, I have a duty to notify the person who's awarding me a contract that I am not eligible underneath the rules. Okay. If I become ineligible, meaning I make a change, or or my certification is challenged because it was done improperly, right? Whatever the reason, I expanded my scope, and the contractor requires a recertification, and I am ineligible, or my ESP, external service provider, were to fail, and I become ineligible, right? Or whatever. Now, at that point, I have to notify, I have the duty and obligation to report the fact that I am ineligible underneath these requirements to my higher tier sub, and from the prime contractor to the DoD contracting officer. So the requirement follows where the CUI is processed, stored, or transmitted on the contractor information system. Okay. It's the contractor information systems we use in performance of the work, on performance of the contract, folks. Okay. Your entire world is not allowed to be in scope. You have to look at the careful restrictions, not only in DoD policy, but in the CR registry and also within the state of 171. It only allows for, underneath configuration management, 3.4.7, only allows for your essential capabilities to be in scope. And what are those essential capabilities? Those things that are necessary to perform the work and to meet the security requirements. Okay. You have the responsibility to the DoD is going to verify the SPRS. You have the responsibility as a higher tier contractor to verify that your lower tier contractor meets requirements. And I'll show you where it says that. It's only those systems that process, store, transmit CUI are allowed to be in scope. Okay. And they must have a CMMC certification or assessment. You have to notify the contracting officer or your higher tier contractor within 72 hours if there are any lapses in your system or change in status. Okay. So you have an incident reporting requirement and standing incident reporting requirement underneath the 7012. That has not changed. Underneath the 7021, you have a duty to report within 72 hours a change in status or eligibility underneath the 7021 contract clause. Okay. Any changes in the contractor information system that processes, stores, or transmits CUI during the contract performance to provide the corresponding DoD UIDs for those contractor information systems to the contracting officer. Okay. The contractor is required to provide the DoD UIDs to the contracting officer. Why? Because the government wants to review them to associate the CMMC certificate and or the self-assessment results with that SPRS score and that eligibility for those systems. Okay. You're required to affirm that everything that you're doing is accurate and consistent with the requirements on an annual basis. So not only do you have to certify, but you have to affirm. And in the cases of the rule disclosure or the rule rollout, you will be required to affirm first. And remember, the eligibility to affirm begins with meeting all the requirements and not meeting requirements with restricted POEM items. Also remember that all of these things follow the 180-day rule, that your POEM items must be closed out when the clock begins in 180 days. So once you've affirmed, you have 180 days and a conditional affirmation in order to complete all your POEM items, or you are no longer eligible for that contract, and you have a duty to report, folks. And you have a duty to report. Okay? False Claims Act. This is hyper danger area for False Claims Act, folks. Okay? And that's the reason why they're writing this. Who's going to do the affirmation? Is it going to be Bob the IT guy? No, it's not Bob the IT guy, the disposable throwaway cannon fodder. Nope. It is the senior company official that's responsible for these requirements. Okay? And is going to attest and affirm that these requirements have been met and sustained during the entire period of the contract performance. Okay. They have to complete this, assign the items, just like I previously discussed, for every single contractor information that processes, stores, or transmits CUI and performance of the work. So let's talk about subcontractors. Okay. So subcontractors, the entire purpose of this entire effort is not to harass prime contractors. It is to get the entire all tiers supply chain in the scope of the requirements in order to protect the data. That is the purpose of this entire effort, folks. So the rule and the contract clause explicitly state that you will include all contractors at all tiers, from the highest to the lowest, when the information qualifies as CUI or FCI, of course, right? So let's take a deeper dive. Certification requires it, folks. Okay. So CMMC certification requirements must be flowed down. This is what the rule states. The contract clause must be flowed down to subcontractors at all tiers when the subcontractor will process, store, transmit CUI based on the sensitivity of the unclassified information flowed down to each of the subcontractors. Now, that doesn't mean that, oh, well, that CUI is not sensitive. That FCI is not sensitive. That's not what that means. They're referring to the fact that if it is FCI, you must meet the level 1 requirements. If it is CUI, you must meet the level 1 or the level 2 requirements or the level 3 requirements, right? So level 3 is going to happen to a very small majority of designated contractors. So if you have FCI and you're going to share CUI performance of the work, you have to meet a level 1, and so do your subcontractors. If you receive or develop CUI performance of the work on behalf of the government, and your contractors will do the subcontractors will do the same, then they must meet at least level 2. You have to require the contractor to ensure that subcontractors also have the appropriate CMC level prior to awarding a subcontract or other contractual instrument. So if you cannot issue a purchase order for something that an organization, a subcontractor, is not ready or it has not met the requisite CMC level. So if it's CMC level 2, because CUI is involved, you cannot issue a subcontract or a PO to them until they meet requirements. Okay, folks, we're less than a year out, for this is real and this is impactful. Okay, I hope you're taking a cold shower. There's no wiggle room, folks. There's no wiggle room here. All right, the requirement is to flow it down. Period. Require the contractor to include the requirements of the clause in subcontract or other contractual instruments. The purpose of the clause is to ensure suppliers at all tiers are in compliance with the security requirements identified in 32 CFR Part 170 when there is a requirement for CMMC in the contract. Okay, and it's based on the information that's flowed down. Again, FCI, level 1, CUI, level 2, FCI and CUI, level 2. Okay, and the CMC program requires this. Subcontracts. It's explicitly stated in the requirement, Part 1. The substance of the clause must be included in all contractual instruments, okay, including the acquisition of commercial products and commercial services, except commercially available off-the-shelf items, okay? So it's explicit, folks. Prior to awarding the contractor or other contractual instruments, ensure that the subcontractor has a current CMC certificate or current self-assessment at the level that's appropriate for the information is being flowed down to the contractor. No ambiguity, no uncertainty. Ensure all subcontractors and suppliers complete and maintain on an annual basis when changes occur in the CMC compliance status an affirmation of their continual compliance with the security requirements required and the requisite with the CMC level required. Okay, for the subcontract or the contractual instrument for each of the contractor information systems that process, store, transmit CUI. Okay, and that are used in performance of the work. What does that look like? So we go back to our diagram again. We've got a contract. We have CUI flowing that's either received or developed in secondary distribution of CUI. Okay, if you don't know, if you never heard of secondary distribution, okay, then you need to read DoD instruction 5230.24, and it will tell you about secondary distribution of CUI, for which you are responsible for identifying and for marking per DoD guidance, folks. When that happens, either primary distribution, secondary distribution of CUI, you are responsible for inheriting the practices associated with this and meeting the requirements associated with this. When CUI flows, through however means, physically or digitally, throughout your enterprise and your external connections or your vendors or suppliers or your outside external service providers, they inherit the security requirements, and you inherit the obligation to ensure that they meet those requirements, period. No ambiguity, no uncertainty, all the way down to the lowest tier. So if you have 17 subcontractors and vendors and outside providers and external service providers that help you meet requirements and perform the contract, you must ensure that they meet those requirements, or you cannot use them. If you're a little guy using a big outside processor and they don't meet requirements, you can't use them. If you're a big guy and you're using a little outside processor and they can't or won't meet requirements, you cannot use them. So let's sort of summarize because we've learned a lot. So we have the DFARS 7012 contract clause right now, or we're going to have a contract clause or subcontract relative to the performance of the work. And it's a DoD contract, subcontract. It involves CUI or FCI, performance of that work. Then there's a requirement to be level 2 certified. Okay. Every contractor information system that processes, stores, or transmits CUI in performance of the work, no matter how many that there are. Our business unit, our 57 other sister business units, our enterprise services that come from our corporate headquarters, they are inherit security controls along with these requirements. Okay, when they process, store, transmit CUI in performance of the work, they inherit the requirements. Period. End of story. No ands, ifs, or buts. Okay, and affirmation of their continuous compliance is required from them, and a DoD UID is assigned to them, right? Unless it's within the scope of your certification, but you, as the obligation holder, are responsible for ensuring that they meet the requirements, even though it may be your corporate headquarters, even though it may be your 17 other sister business units, even though it may be your external service provider. It doesn't matter. You are responsible underneath DoD policy. Okay. So we receive CUI, contractor information system. Now we have security inheritance underneath the 7021. No ambiguity, no uncertainty. Okay. Each of those organizations must have a DoD unique ID. It must have its own assessment. It must have an SPRS score. And we have to meet requirements, right? That because why? Because we process, store, or transmit CUI, we have to do these things. Okay, that's the reason why. So the procedures are for these requirements are explicitly stated in the 7021 clause, and it's very clear that the contracting officers have the obligation to check, and they cannot award a contract, and they're not going to place their career at risk by not checking, okay, and meeting these requirements. I can assure you that. Okay. Again, because they have this obligation, they have to ensure that each of the covered information systems has their DoD UID, has met the requirements, has a valid SPRS score, is registered in the requirements because they process, store, transmit CUI. That's all the obligation principally of the DoD contractor, contracting officer, or the 7021 clause passes that obligation down to the higher tier sub to its lower tier subs. Okay. The results of those requirements must be validated prior to the award, whether you're a prime contractor receiving the award from the DoD or whether you're a subcontractor and receiving the award from a higher tier subcontractor. Okay, exact same process, folks. Again, the DoD, each unique identifier is going to add traceability for all of these requirements, folks. Okay. And it all boils down to process, store, transmit CUI and the performance of the work. Okay. If it's not valid, if it's not integrated in the SPRS system, it does not exist and you're not eligible for the award. If you are ineligible, you have the duty to report, and that is going to come down in your terms and conditions. But not just your terms and conditions, you have the legal obligation to report to the higher tier subcontractor, and there's no longer any place to hide, folks. Okay. When something goes awry, in summary, okay, in your environment, either you're preparing for assessment, preparing for certification, you have certification, and you're affirming on an annual basis. If something changes, you have the duty to report. Okay. In that continuous appliance, that duty to report comes from, the affirmation comes from, not from Bob, the IT guy, who's disposable, right? or that quality manager, right, who we can just fire and get rid of, and we don't have to worry about them anymore. Whoops, they made a mistake. It's not the way that this is going to go down, folks. The train is going to roll over organizations, and it's there that process is actually already underway. Okay. With that, let's take a few minutes and let's ask some questions, if we may. I hope this has been helpful. If it has been helpful, I appreciate your comments in the
It's actually in the Q&A right now. You've got 5 open questions.
Okay. All right, let me all right, let's see. So will third-party ID provide will third-party
I think
ID?
they're saying provider need to be CMMC certified.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
The answer underneath the current draft rule is yes. The answer is yes. You must be CMMC certified if you provide security protection for the data, right? You inherit the requirements, right? That's very, very plain. If you do not provide security protection for the requirements, but you access the requirements through an external connection, 3.1.20, you must be compliant. Now, compliance doesn't mean certified, and there are a number of different ways to do that, but you must be compliant with the requirements if you have access to CUI. What are the requirements if we don't have a contract with the DFARS 252, 204, 7, and 12 clause? We have CUI through quoting activity, so there is no contract award. Aaron, that's a really interesting process. So right now, there is ambiguity about the fact that let's say I've already been awarded the contract, Aaron. Since I've been awarded the contract, I'm providing CUI to you, Aaron, in order for you to provide a proposal back to me, a bid for the work. Well, right now, when I award you the contract for the work that you gave the bid on, that becomes CUI that you have in your environment. Prior to that award of the contract by me, then you're under obligation to protect the data, and I'm under obligation to ensure that you're handling the requirements appropriately. Okay. However, underneath the CMC rule, you will not be eligible at all to receive that information unless you are eligible to receive the contract award. Why? Because I'm not eligible. I'm not allowed or permitted to provide CUI to you for you to process, store, or transmit CUI unless you meet requirements. Okay, so that's going to shift. That's going to shift significantly. All right. If we are certified and have a UID for 20 users, PCs, and then add another 20 users, into the environment, the new PC is not covered underneath the DoD UID. That's not necessarily true. So the contracting officer has the discretion, or the company, higher tier contractor, has the discretion to require you to recertify if there's a substantive change to the environment, or there's a belief that your previous certification did not meet the requirements in order to appropriately protect the information. Okay, so many people have sort of secretly schemed. Well, I'm going to get two computers certified, and and have have this pristine environment, easy to do, in theory, and only have 2 computers, and then I'll just add the other 50 computers after that, because I don't have to worry about that. Well, if you have a change to the environment, guess what? That's a reportable environment, right? So I'm hoping. There's a reasonable expectation, hope's not a method, there's a reasonable expectation that the DoD is going to provide clarifying guidance on what constitutes a change to the environment, right? And that will be the stickler. Next one, follow up. DoD UIDs. Is a prime contractor required to provide the government not only their DoD UID with respect to the information systems that process, store, transmit CUI, but also their tier subs? Yes. Yep. So they're going to have a mapping capability, you better believe it, from the prime contractor through every single contractor. Okay. Now those out there who are astute are going to say, well, contract privity says that you can't do that. Well, that was the reason for that was because there was no compelling government interest. There is a compelling government interest because the law specifically requires that your compliance be verified and validated. So the idea for contract privity was well, they're not allowed to have that information, and that's never going to happen. It is happening, folks, and you had better believe that the DoD UID is intended to track your the reality of your environment, the size of your environment, to the certification, to who did the certification, right? To the contract and all the contracts that you perform. And so if you add, let's say you had 50 contracts and you had a two-person environment that was certified, do you think that's going to last? No, it's not. Okay, so people are trying to duck and shimmy their way out of this. They're going to get crunched. All right. So Tara Lemieux is part of the CMC Industry Standards Council, and she is outstanding. And I have to admit with some chagrin that Tara provided me her book, but I have not yet read it. Okay. So I am very sorry that I can't speak to the details of that book. However, I will tell you that I would take a bullet for Tara Lemieux if she said something to me about CMMC. She's excellent at what she does. And so I would recommend anything that she has to say blindly, and the devil's in the details as always. Okay. Do not trust anyone. Do not trust anything that I say. Do not trust anyone that anyone tells you unless they can show you in writing why it says it and where it says it. Okay. And that doesn't matter. Regan Edens, he does this and done that for Cyber AB or standards or blah, 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 blah. None of that matters, folks. What matters is not glittering generalities. It's not platitudes. It's not people who stand on a stage in front of you in a conference and make something up because they don't know the right answer. Buyer beware. Okay. Do we need for 48 CFR, John Long?
I think he might be asking, what do we need for 48 CFR, but I'm not sure.
So the 48 CFR provides the authority for the DFARS contract clauses themselves. Okay. So when you look at the 48 CFR 252, 204, 7012, that is the authority for the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. If you look at the 48 CFR 252, 204, 7019, and 7021, those are the authorities for the DFARS contract clauses, right? For the 7019, 7020, 7021. Now, what's interesting about the 32 CFR Part 170 rule is that it falls underneath the national security, which can be adopted across multiple agencies. Okay. So that's probably the intent of having it as a 32 CFR rule. All right. So Tom Snowdy, since there are limited resources to get certifications, do you think a company has a DIPCAC high assessment will be equal to being certified? Tom, that's a tough, underneath the original DIPCAC guidance, the answer would have been yes. Okay. But I'm not sure that guidance there. Remember, there's always a little asterisk. That guidance is substitute. That is, what do they say? It is, anyway, it escapes me, but remember that things change, and what the DIPCAC promised, so to speak, right, is subject to change. That's what I was going to say. I don't know why that escaped me. So what I would say to you is this, is that the grace is going to become a freight train, Tom. Okay. And I would not expect grace. So what I would say is that if you had a DIPCAC high in the last 3 years, hopefully it will roll over. But you should be prepared, because you're going to have to affirm. Number one, you will have to affirm regardless. So even if they roll over and give you equivalency and certification, you will have to affirm. That's going to have happen by a senior officer, right, of the company. So what I would say to you is that it may save you, but you've got to be prepared to sustain and meet requirements anyway, right? So I wish I could give you a better answer than that. All right. So Janet asks, do you have a sense on how external service providers will qualify to assess for the vast majority? They won't have contracts directly with the DoD. That's true. So Janet, she makes, I think she's alluding to a really great point she may be aware of, is that managed service providers or external service providers do not have a direct contract with the DoD. They do have a direct contract with you, and the DoD requires you. There's many of you should know this. I hope that you do. That there's something called the DoD Procurement Toolbox. You need to write this down. DoD Procurement Toolbox, Cybersecurity FAQ, and it'll take you to the DoD Procurement Toolbox, and then you'll click over to cybersecurity, and then it'll take you to the FAQ, and then you'll download a document. That is standing DoD policy in its examples, in the questions and the answers. It's not a normal FAQ. Okay. Normally, the FAQ represents policy, but in this case, what the answers inside of that FAQ are DoD policy underneath the DoD memorandum. What that means is that the guidance that they provide you is rock solid. Okay. So if you look in that FAQ, what it's going to tell you is that anyone who receives CUI who provides services to you is required to meet requirements, and you are required to ensure that they meet requirements. So underneath the shared responsibility matrix of a contract or a service level agreement, you must have an agreement that says that they will meet requirements, that they and then anything that they do for you must be substantiated by a body of evidence which proves the fact that they do what they say. All right. So whether or not that's explicitly stated in the 32 CFR Part 170 rule when it becomes a final rule, or whether it's just standing in DoD policy, it is still the requirement. So if our company is a body shop and the only place our staff see CUIs while on federal property, with none transmitted to our facility, are required to have a CMC level 2 certified. Okay, understand that we will process FCI within our system. Sure. Okay, so yes, for sure, you're going to have to be a level 1. So that there's no doubt about that. However, I can tell you from experience, we had a client, okay, who we advised sought our services. We did an analysis for them, and we said, look, you don't have to be. It was in the exact same situation. All of their people were on site of the DoD, and we told them, look, you don't have to do this, right? You do the DFARS 7012 is in your contract. You can request to the program office or to the contracting officer or the Corps the fact that this is a requirement of you in your contract, but your people that process, store, transmit CUI are on site and they're using your equipment, government funded equipment, and that doesn't even touch our environment. Okay, and they can relieve you of the requirement. And they would not do it. Okay, they were scared of they worked for the Marine Corps, and they didn't have a great relationship with the Corps, and they did not want to risk it. So they went ahead and we got them on their way. So what I would say to you is that if you have a good, strong relationship with your Corps and with the contracting office, then you should, in all fairness, approach them. You can have an analysis done by somebody like us, which makes it very clear that you're not trying to you're not trying to snake out of the requirements or anything like that. And is a solid, detailed analysis, and say, look, this is a significant cost to us. Can we be relieved of this requirement, and it only be impactful to our folks on site, and they be trained and be fully eligible and qualified to meet to handle CUI on your site, your government site, and hopefully they will be fair to you and relieve you of the requirements. Okay. So how do we do SPRS for level 1? So that's interesting. So there is no requirement for SPRS for level 1, John. And so and the reason for that is because remember that the DoD self-assessment method or DoD assessment methodology right now, the V.1.2.1, does not requires you to go through all 110 requirements. Okay. Now the CMC assessment methodology may change that. Okay, it may change that. The CMC assessment methodology could bifurcate, meaning split that into a level 1 assessment methodology for level 1, and then have a level 2 assessment methodology, and then have even a level 3 assessment methodology. And that may be what they're planning. But as of now, there's no way to do that. And the SPRS system itself right now is not geared to accept an SPRS score for a level 1 organization. Peter Bagley asks if an RP or CCP is helping an organization prepare for their official assessment, for CMC 2.0, is the RP or CCP required? CCP means a CMMC certified professional, for those of you who don't know, or a registered practitioner. Okay, are they required to be CMC 2.0 certified as well? Absolutely not. So, Peter, here's some important aspects of that, though, right? Number one is that you should never process, store, transmit CUI in performance of your work in helping them meet requirements. So as DTC Global, we never receive CUI, we never process or store CUI in performance of our work. Now, I have been a part of organizations and reviewed thousands of potential CUI documents over hundreds and hundreds of hours in performance of our work. But that's because I have lawful government purpose, because I'm fully eligible and qualified to meet those requirements as a authorized holder of CUI, and you must be too, right? As a CCP and RP, when you handle CUI or you help them navigate CUI and determine through the CUI discovery process, is what we call it, what is CUI and what isn't CUI, and all of that. So you must be fully eligible to meet requirements and qualified to meet requirements in order to handle CUI, and that includes navigating that process. But you yourself and your environment should never process, store, transmit CUI. If you did do that, then you would be required to meet requirements. To be clear, John says, so is 48 CFR operative, or is there still a period of time before it goes into effect? So, John, that's something that I failed to mention in the very beginning, and thank you for bringing that up. So right now, the CMC Industry Standards Council is working on the comments for the DFARS 7021 rule in submission to the Federal Registry, not ONR. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. I've got too much of my brain here. So into the organization, dadgum, OEB. There you go. So that adjudicates these DFARS clauses. Okay. So they're going to receive all the comments, just like on the 21 rule, adjudicate those comments, and then that could be an interim rule, meaning they could immediately issue that out. Which is probably likely, actually, or it could end up being on the anniversary of receiving of that requirement, then issue the final rule. But it's likely, because of the timing of CMMC, it's likely that that's going to be an interim rule. So David Hammerstrom says, what constitutes a reportable cyber incident as opposed to an unreportable incident? Okay, David, that's a great question. So you need to look underneath the 32 CFR Part 236, okay? Many of you don't even know that exists. So Google, go to Google Cornell, 32 CFR Part 236, and read the details there. Why Cornell? Because Cornell Law has a really great online depiction of the requirements that are hyperlinked to definitions and so on and so forth, and I highly recommend that you use them, okay? That will provide you the criteria for cyber incident reporting. Okay. That criteria, though, is going to expand. It's going to expand underneath the Cyber Incident Reporting Act for Critical Infrastructure on 2020, 2022, 2023. Okay. Cyber Incident Reporting Act for Critical Infrastructure. Okay. That expands the requirements for what and also better defines the requirements for what is a cyber incident and what is reportable. And that by law must be adopted by the DoD. And so you can get ahead of yourself. Great question. You can get ahead of yourself to know what is it right now underneath the Part 236, and what is it going to expand to underneath the Cyber Incident Reporting Act for Critical Infrastructure 2023. Okay. Let's see. Joel Melvin. So DOE's C2M2. Okay, so Joel, I was very fortunate to be a part of we're really hitting some great gamut of some really great questions here. So kudos to you guys. I really appreciate these great questions. So Joel, I was underneath the part of the DOE's sort of lean into the CMMC requirements when I served on the Cyber AB board. Since then, they've developed a plan, right? And the DoD is absolutely going to adopt CMMC. So that's going to happen. So there is going to, my expectation is that there is going to be a break-in period from C2M2, okay, during the period of adoption. So what you're going to see is when the final rule comes out, okay, because the DOE is waiting on the finalization of all these requirements, right? You're going to see the DoD have a break-in period over the period of implementation of CMMC. That's going to happen. All right. So that now here's also what's interesting about DOE that you may not be aware of. If you could, Xavier, if you could leave the question up until I complete it, because
sure, no problem.
To reference it, no problem. So if Joel, the DoD policy, DOE policy has additional requirements that are detailed that the DoD policy does not have. So if you are a DOE or DOE contractor, you need to read DOE's policy because they've updated their policies about CUI and the protection of CUI, and they add in additional requirements, okay, above and beyond what the DoD has. And you need to be careful and read those requirements and be familiar with them, okay? Because the vast majority of DoD doesn't even know their own subcontractors don't even know their own requirements underneath DoD policy, much less DOE's. But they are even more detailed in the requirements and the reporting of the requirements than the DoD. Okay, so Janet, so follow up to my question on external service providers. How will they get a certification, or will this be like FedRAMP equivalency? No. So hang on. So there's an important bifurcation in external service providers that probably should have. This is like 5 or 6 slides, so I'm going to be brief. Janet, is that? Let's see. How can I explain this? There are 2 types of service provider, external service providers. Okay, and we've submitted comments to help this clarify the ambiguity here. All right. So if you didn't know this, this is normal. All right. Type 1, if you will, are external service providers that will be required to be certified, okay, that provide services for the protection, security protection data. They can provide services for everything but processing, storing, and transmitting CUI, okay? If they process, store, transmit CUI, then they fall into the cloud service provider, part 2 of the external service providers. Well, maybe there are 3. So you can have external service provider that provides services that access CUI. You have an external service provider and they access CUI how? Through an external connection, 3.1.20. You can have external service provider that provides security protection data, okay? Or it protects CUI and process, stores, or transmits security protection data. Both of those are going to inherit the certification requirements, right? Now, there are different ways that you can finagle on the first one, but the second one will absolutely have to be certified, all right? The third one is those cloud service providers. Well, wait, they're different from external service provider. Right now, they're entangled in the definition, okay? But if I have an external service provider through an external connection, 3.1.20, that processes, stores, or transmits CUI, I am, by definition, of the DoD, a cloud service provider. Doesn't matter if I'm big Microsoft or if I'm a little managed service provider out there, providing, a server, or server farm or whatever, data center or whatever. It doesn't matter. You process, store, transmit CUI in your environment as an external service provider, you qualify to be a cloud service provider. You must be FedRAMP moderate or certified. All right. So underneath the FedRAMP moderate certified criteria, there is equivalency. The equivalency memorandum, which you may or may not know about, was issued by the DoD CUI. It is a higher standard than the FedRAMP moderate certified standard, and I don't have time to get into the details of why. They are revising that standard on equivalency to the appropriate level, which it should be revised down to make it commensurate with the actual FedRAMP qualifications. Now, at the end of the day, folks, there will be far, far more FedRAMP moderate equivalency organizations and applications than ever even imagined underneath the FedRAMP ATO program. Why? Because the FedRAMP ATO program is narrowly constrained to those that provide that are sponsored by the federal agencies. There are only 230 something FedRAMP authorized organizations out there right now, and the reason why is because they have a specific need. The FedRAMP program cannot possibly meet the demand of the thousands of potential applications and providers out there that are going to be encompassed within the FedRAMP equivalency. Okay, so I hope that you followed what I've said, because it's pictures are better than just talking to it. So I apologize if that's confusing. So at the end of the day, the first two categories of external service providers will have to be certified. The third category that will meet the criteria because they process, store, transmit CUI will have to be meaning the cloud service provider FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, and the equivalency standard will be revised down and will be reissued underneath the revised memorandum. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. That's a really complicated topic, and I could do a war room completely on that topic. Our risk and security assessments and plan of action milestones and SSP and network topology that deflects the enclave considered technical information. Absolutely not, Peter. So there is a problem out there right now with this understanding. Okay, the DoD for their own internal purposes have labeled it CUI underneath an obscure reason. Okay, that doesn't apply to you. Doesn't apply to you as a C3PO. Doesn't apply to you as a managed service provider. It does not meet the definition for CUI, which is required in the CUI registry. Okay, so it is not CUI. There's no way, no how. It doesn't matter what the DoD says. It doesn't matter what the DIPCAC says. Okay, and with all due respect to them, and I taught most of the provisional assessors. They know better, but some of the new teams do not know better. Okay, so it is not CUI. It cannot qualify as CUI. They cannot require you to protect it as CUI. The DoD can't, but this Cyber AB can require you to protect that data in a CUI environment. Okay, they can't be as a term underneath certification. Okay, so again, that's a complicated set of circumstances, but I just want you to know that the information, SSP, your assessments, none of that is CUI. It doesn't meet the definition for CUI. It can't be CUI legally, and that's the way it is until the definitions are changed. Okay, and that's it. And you can cash your check on that truth. All right. So, and that's it, I guess. So
we have one last question. The rest of them are really thank yous and nice comments. But there's one last at the bottom from John Hill.
John Hill, I don't see it. Oh, thank you, Brenda. Appreciate that. You're very, very sweet. John Hill. Okay, last one. It is my understanding that managed service providers will be classified as external service provider. That's true. Okay, that's true. And will require CMMC certification. That's true too, John. Unless you process, store, transmit CUI. If you process, store, transmit CUI through an external connection, okay, you do qualify as a cloud service provider. That is not going to change. Not going to change. Okay. And if you, John, have any questions about that, you can always reach out to me direct and we can talk about that. I don't mind explaining in detail. All right. All right. Well, listen, you guys are very kind. Thank you very much for your kind remarks. I genuinely appreciate them. If you found this to be valuable, please make comments on LinkedIn. And we will post this war room, the link to this so you can review it. I know it's a lot to digest. And we will post this on our DTC Global's blog, or in our blog section, I think, or webinar
On the
section.
website, yes.
Yeah. And so you can certainly refer to that. And if you ever have any questions, our contact information is in there, and we will and we're happy to help provide you guidance. I don't care whether or not you're another consultant. Whatever I can do to help you have a clear understanding of the requirements is my solemn duty and obligation, and I take that very seriously. So I thank you for the opportunity to serve you and spend time with you and collaborate with you in the future. And it truly matters that I believe that together we can secure our controlled and classified information and protect our defense industrial base from our enemies. So thank you for that opportunity, and we look forward to more in the future. Have a great day.